the Einspruch lecture is really very much a flagship of the Ackerman Center and has been that for many, many years. We are just listing out here the individuals who gave the lecture. It's, in other words, if you go down that list, it's really the who's who in Holocaust studies. And we've been really, really fortunate over many years to have had that opportunity to bring a distinguished speaker to Dallas and to address both the wider community as well as the academic UTD community. And annually, we're adding on new names to this list, obviously. And this year, we're very, very pleased, obviously, with our success of securing, under these slightly more challenging circumstances, yet another outstanding Einspruch lecture. So you can see already yourself here that you're lining up really with the who's who in this particular field. We also call it always the short list to the reading list for our students who have to take field exams. So we just say, here they are. Just acquaint yourself with the various speakers and you'll be in perfect shape. But this over the years has really also connected the center and connected us also in many ways with the community that every year looks forward to this event. And obviously we did not want this to not happen this year, but we agonized obviously over the limited or different types of choices. And I think what we came up with this year just couldn't have been any more perfect. Cindy, if you don't mind, otherwise slide me back to the Ackerman Center, or do you think, is that the green light message now?
Nope, there you go.
There, okay. Then just maybe a few more words about the Ackerman Center. We are, old for a young university, meaning the Holocaust Studies program itself is over 30 years old. The center is a little younger. By now, we are a center with 5 endowed professors. We are dedicated to the study of the Holocaust, genocide, and human rights studies. And we are situated within an interdisciplinary school of the arts and humanities, which I think is quite appropriate considering that the subject matter of the Holocaust can never be entirely studied just from one discipline. And so therefore, I think it was probably good coincidence that the center ended up not in a department of history or department of literature or philosophy, but rather in this much more open and varied environment of the school. Since we're starting backwards, I think it might be also a good time to introduce myself. So my name is Niels Romer. I'm the director of the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies, but also the interim dean of the School of the Arts and Humanities. And so for that reason, I'm filling in these moments here and keep you entertained until we get the green light. In the meantime, I'll use this opportunity maybe to welcome some of our distinguished friends. Already on top of the hour, welcomed our president, President Benson, and his wife, Leslie, Provost Inga Musselman, as well as Dean Jennifer Holmes. And then, of course, many of our friends and members of our distinguished board that has over the years helped us to create really what I think at this point has become a very unique and very thriving center of Holocaust, genocide, and human rights studies. I believe that I'm now moved to this slide because we're good to go. All right, and it's my great pleasure now to officially welcome you all really to the beginning of this year Einspruch lecture and to introduce our various individual and very distinguished speakers. I'm going to present them in the order in which they're going to appear, starting out with Michael Bryant, who's going to talk about the International Military Tribunal trial of Hermann Goering and some of the other top Nazis. Now, each one of these distinguished individuals keeps busy, so they have very distinguished biographies. I will go for some of the highlights, but there's obviously a lot more to be said about each one of them. So Michael Bryant is professor of history and legal studies at Bryant University in Smithfield, Rhode Island, and an adjunct professor of law at Creighton University Law School in Omaha, Nebraska. And now it comes. He's the author of 4 books, Confronting the Good Death, Nazi Euthanasia on Trial, 1945 to 53, Eyewitness to Genocide, the Operation Reinhardt Death Camp Trials, 55 to 66, A World History of War Crimes from Antiquity to the Present, and Nazi Crimes and Their Punishment, a short history with documents. His Eyewitness to Genocide was awarded the Book of the Year Award from the American National Chapter Association of the International panel in 2015. But he's far from being done. His fifth book, co-authored casebook entitled Global Legal Traditions, Comparative Law for the 21st Century, will be published in late 2020, early 21, while his sixth book, titled Mein Kampf and the Holocaust, will appear in 21. And then, of course, we have Ben Ferencz himself, chief prosecutor to the Einsatzgruppen Nuremberg trial number 9, of whom you've learned already much if you took some time to watch the video. And we'll see again some clips today as well from that video. There's probably something that was quite, predetermined about him. I guess if you're born in 1920, in the immediate aftermath of the First World War, and the year when the League of Nations came into existence, you had to think about establishing international frameworks of international peace and justice, and that in many ways remained his mission throughout his life. And if you again watch the interview, then you could see, and it has remained his mission to this day. He really tellingly at the end made everyone fall into this never stop, never give up. And so I think he very much embodies this to this last part of that video, also when he brings forward all these hefty volumes that he has helped to produce or that are being produced about him. Our next speaker then in line will be Michael Bazyler, who will talk about the Holocaust in Nuremberg. Michael is a professor of law and in 1939 Society Law Scholar in Holocaust and Human Rights Studies at the Fowler School of Law at Chapman University in California. He's the author of Holocaust, Genocide, and the Law, A Quest for Justice in a Post-Holocaust World. Came out in 2016, distinguished winner of the 2016 National Jewish Book Award, and Law and the Holocaust, U.S. Cases and Materials, came out as a co-authored volume in 2018. He also has testified in Congress on the issue of Holocaust restitution, and his writings have been cited by U.S. Supreme Courts. He's also the author of 7 books and numerous other articles on the subject of law and the Holocaust. And then last, but very much not least, is Kristen Nelson, who will talk about the legacies of Nuremberg 75 years later. In many ways, much to the bewilderment, probably it would be fair to say, of Ben Ferencz, these legacies are to this day unresolved. And if anything, presumably these days, even more again on the forefront of our minds. So Kristen Nelson is of counsel to a boutique Los Angeles law, and I have to apologize, I stumbled over the boutique and I thought, what is a boutique law firm? But it's probably something that looks really nice. And probably is very, very special. So she's of counsel to a boutique Los Angeles law firm and has extensive experience in litigating high stakes atrocities and asset recovery cases in the United States courts. She teaches graduate students at Gratz College in the area of Holocaust, genocide, and international law. And she was a project manager and lead researcher on a multi-year Holocaust real property restitution study commissioned by the Prague-based European Shoah Legacy Institute. The findings of the study were published in 2019 by Oxford University Press. I'm going to hand now over. Each one of these distinguished speakers will have about 12 minutes. And then we will take it from there, and then obviously toward the end, open up the channel for question, comments, and the likes. So thank you again all for being here. I'm going to mute myself now and fall in line with everyone else and hand over.
Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, yes.
Good, good, good. I'm going to try to share my screen because all of us have little PowerPoint presentations to accompany our lectures today. So let me share my screen. Everybody see the first slide, the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg?
Not
No.
yet.
No,
Not yet. Okay.
nothing.
Nothing yet. How about now?
No.
No. Nope. Not yet. You do have permission to share though, so It should be on.
Okay, I clicked share screen. Let me try it again. Here we go.
It's black with a white icon of a body.
Okay. For some reason. Okay, can you see it now or not?
No.
All right, I might have to do without. I can't bring it up. I don't know what the issue is. I had a Zoom meeting not long ago. I was able to bring it up without any difficulty at all. I do not know what to do, except maybe go on without the slideshow.
Or maybe
How is it-
email it to Cindy.
Yeah, Mike, try to unshare the screen, unshare, and then
Okay.
try again from the beginning. Sometimes that works for me.
Okay.
And then you have to, after you share screen, you have to hit share again down at the bottom. Sometimes I miss that. So you got to do it twice.
Okay, let's try it again.
Okay, yep. You should be able to, yeah, there you go.
Brilliant. Okay,
Success.
about that. We're all learning in this environment, aren't we? I mean, it's just it's a lesson every time you try to do a lecture or a presentation. But at any rate, we're good to go then. Niels, thank you very much for your introduction. I'm so pleased to be able to participate in the Burton Einspruch Holocaust lecture this year, along with my colleagues. And as the slide in front of you demonstrates, I'm going to be introducing the topic of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. And I think it's helpful when approaching this topic to consider the roots of the IMT, as it's called, at Nuremberg, which really go back into World War II, and specifically the first reports of the final solution as these begin to trickle out of Eastern Europe in the spring and summer of 1942. And these early reports, the very first reports of the final solution, as they make it back to Allied political leaders in the West, provoke a series of warnings by leaders like Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, who warned the Nazis at that time that there would be repercussions, there would be consequences for the atrocities that they were carrying out, primarily in Eastern Europe at that time. We know the history, of course. We have the benefit of hindsight in that respect. We know that the Battle of Stalingrad is fought and lost by the Germans already by early 1943. So at this point, it's quite clear that the Nazis are going to lose the war. And not coincidentally, a few months later then, in the fall of 1943, a major conference takes place in Moscow between the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union for the purpose of forming a concerted war crimes trial policy. And this policy, as set forth in the so-called Moscow Declaration, would consist of two parts. And each part is going to deal with a different category of Nazi war criminal. The first category that the Allies wanted to eventually deal with once the war was over were the lower ranking perpetrators. So these were not the top figures in the government, but the next level down. And these individuals, according to the Moscow Declaration, would be extradited to the countries in which they had committed their crimes, where they would face trial then in front of national courts. This is the first level, the first part of what the Allies intended as their war crimes trial program once the war was over. There would be an additional category then, and this is the second level of the plan. There would be an additional category of Nazi war criminals whom the Moscow Declaration referred to as the major war criminals. And these were individuals whose crimes had no geographical localization, according to the Declaration. Their crimes were spread across the breadth of the continental landmass. And you could not simply pinpoint a specific location on the European continent where these individuals were solely responsible for the crimes. Their crimes were vast and all-encompassing. These individuals would be exempted from the extradition policy of the first category of war criminals. These major war criminals would be exempted. How would they be dealt with? It wasn't really clear. What the declaration said is that they would be punished later on by a joint decision of the Allies. Now, that's appropriately ambiguous, isn't it? What does joint decision mean? It's certainly not clear on its face. And what's interesting is that in the years since the Nuremberg war crimes trials, scholars will sometimes interpret this language to mean an international court, an international tribunal. But in fact, insofar as we can tell, this was not necessarily in the minds of the policymakers at this time. What we do know is that in 1943 and into 1944, the British and the Americans were leaning quite strongly in the direction of summary execution without the benefit of trial for the major war criminals. The Soviets in particular wanted, the Soviets in addition to the British and the Americans actually had a different idea. What they wanted to do was put the major war criminals on trial, but not give them the benefit of a fair trial. The trial would be something akin to Stalin's show trials carried out against his alleged political enemies in the 1930s. So of the three allies, only the Soviets at that time in 1943 and 44 wanted an actual trial for the major war criminals, and that wasn't even really a true proceeding in the spirit that we think of today. The Americans will eventually swing around on this issue for various reasons. By late 1944 and early 1945, the Americans determined that, yes, indeed, an international court would be a suitable place in which to confront the atrocities, the crimes of the top-ranking Nazis. And so from that point forward until the spring and summer of 1945, they successfully lobbied the British to subscribe to the trials idea. And by May and June of 1945, Churchill in particular has agreed that, that summary executions would not be carried out as he had fondly hoped for, but instead the major war criminals would be put on trial in front of an international court. Now, of course, at this point then, had to be a decision about where this trial would take place. And this is an aerial view an aerial shot taken from an airplane of the Nuremberg Palace of Justice and the attached prison from November of 1945, around the time that the actual trial would begin. This was the site of the International Military Tribunal. Well, why did the Allies choose this site of, among all the many sites they could possibly have held the court in? And there has been, again, a lot of speculation over the years by various scholars who've written on this topic about Nuremberg being a symbol of the Nazi movement. It's where the Nuremberg rallies were held in the 1920s and 30s. And then the Allies were sending a message by holding the top Nazis accountable for their crimes in Nuremberg. I'm not persuaded by that argument. In fact, I think the reason was quite pragmatic. It was one of the few fully functioning courthouses that had not been bombed to smithereens during the war. And it had a functioning prison attached to the courthouse in which the accused Nazi war criminals could be interned and then brought over from their prison cell into the court for sessions of the court. So I think the reason was entirely practical. Once the decision had been made that the top war criminals would be subjected to a criminal trial, the Allies sent representatives to London in the summer of 1945, where they eventually produce a charter called, appropriately enough, the London Charter of August 1945. And in the charter, there is a detailed enumeration of the charges that would be leveled against the major war criminals. And they were 5 altogether, 5 charges. Some of these, I'm sure that many of the people listening to our lecture today have heard of before. All of them are listed in Article 6, crimes against peace in Article 6A, which were based on the concept of aggressive war, the unprovoked, offensive invasion of other countries, which obviously the Nazis had done during the war. These were deemed to be violations of the Kellogg-Briand Pact and other treaties that the Germans had signed and were being chargeable as international crimes against the Nazis. Article 6B contained the war crimes charge against the Nazis. These were violations of the law of war, specifically two treaties, the Hague Convention and then the Geneva Conventions, especially the Geneva Convention of 1929. The third charge against the war criminals at Nuremberg was contained in Article 6C, and this was crimes against humanity, crimes involving murder and extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other inhumane acts, as it was described by the Charter. And as I mentioned before, many of you probably have heard of these offenses before, and they continue, especially war crimes and crimes against humanity, continue as charges under international law even today. But there are two additional charges that the Nazis were facing. First, they were facing charges of conspiracy. Well, what specifically did this contemplate? In addition to the substantive offenses they were charged with, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, the Nazis were also charged with conspiring to commit crimes against peace, conspiring to commit war crimes, and conspiring to commit crimes against humanity. And then, in addition to this charge, there was a charge against the so-called criminal organizations in Articles 9 and 10 of the Charter. The prosecutors, the Allied prosecutors, were inviting, under Articles 9 and 10, they were inviting the IMT to criminalize 7 Nazi organizations and have them specifically designated as criminal. And I'll talk a little bit later on about the 7. Ultimately, only 4 of them would be found to be criminal organizations by the IMT, and those were the SS, the SA, the Gestapo, and the leadership corps of the Nazi Party. Now, you will notice as you look at the charges under the London Charter that there is one spectacular crime that is not mentioned here that the Nazis really were guilty of. And you could probably fill in the blank, I think, just by looking at these 5 charges. What charge do you not see there? You do not see genocide charged against the Nazis. And in fact, it was not charged against them. There was a belief at the time among Allied policymakers and lawyers that genocide, because it was so new in international law as an offense, just did not have enough of a pedigree. It didn't have enough of an anchoring in international law to be justiciable, to be chargeable against the Nazis at Nuremberg. And so they decided not to charge the Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg with this offense. Instead, and this is true even today, genocide is a type of a crime against humanity. It's actually embedded within Article 6C of crimes against humanity. So crimes against Jews committed by the Nazis were deemed to be crimes against humanity, were not charged against the major war criminals as genocide at Nuremberg. Even though the indictment, if you take a look at the indictment rendered in October of 1945, you'll see references to genocide, but it was not charged against them. Well, once this document was produced, then the next determination to be made was who exactly would be deemed to be a major war criminal, who would be put on trial. This is the decision that people like Robert Jackson, who was the American head of the Office for War Crimes Prosecution at Nuremberg. This is a decision that he and his colleagues had to make. Who would be prosecuted? Who would be on the list of people to be hauled in front of the tribunal at Nuremberg? If you take a look at a document that is actually available on the internet today, it's Jackson's report to President Truman in May of 1945. He talks about this. He tells Truman about his criteria for choosing whom to charge at Nuremberg. And he says that only the major war criminals involved in the Nazis' master plan, the master plan to conquer and enslave the world, he wrote, would be tried at the IMT, that is at Nuremberg. The lower ranking people, the hands-on perpetrators and some of the intermediate people between the top criminals and the hands-on perpetrators at ground level, these individuals, these small fry as they were called, would be prosecuted in national trials in accordance with the Moscow Declaration or in military commissions carried out by Allied armies in Europe. When the IMT began its work in November of 1945, 21 defendants sat in the dock. 24 defendants had been indicted, so you only had 21 of the 24 actually present in the courtroom at the time. 3 of these individuals were either deceased or were deemed to be incompetent to stand trial. Robert Lai, who was the head of the German Labor Front, was dead. He committed suicide while awaiting trial. And then, of course, Martin Bormann, whom the Allies thought at the time might still be alive, and he was indicted in absentia, but we now believe he was probably killed in the waning days of the war. But neither of these 2 individuals was there. And of course, Gustav Krupp, the head of the Krupp-Werke that was charged with arming Hitler to commit his crimes against peace, was deemed to be mentally incompetent to stand trial. The remaining defendants who were hauled in front of the court in Nuremberg in November were the heads of major Nazi organizations involved in Nazi criminality. And these included top military leaders, people like Alfred Jodl, who was the chief of the Army Operations Staff and the German High Command. Wilhelm Keitel, who was a top official within the Armed Forces High Command. And Erich Raeder, the Supreme Commander of the Navy, among others. Of course, the most notorious defendant at Nuremberg, you probably, again, those of you who are here know a thing or two about the Nuremberg trials. So you probably know who this person was. Who's the top defendant at Nuremberg? He actually lent his name to the trial itself. It was this guy, Hermann Goering, the Reichsmarschall, the plenipotentiary for the 4-year plan, and chief of the German Air Force. Now, in addition to these and other defendants, as I'd mentioned previously, there were 7 Nazi organizations that were accused of being criminal organizations. And these were, I have a list of them here on your slide, the SS, the Gestapo, the Leadership Corps of the Nazi Party, the Security Service, the German General Staff, the SA, and the Reich Cabinet. Of this number, only the first 4 would be designated as criminal organizations, the SS, Gestapo, Leadership Corps, and the Security Service, which meant that henceforth, a court would only have to show that a person had a membership in one of these organizations and contributed to its nefarious purposes in some way, and that would be presumptive evidence of criminal wrongdoing, and the person could be convicted on that basis alone. I'd like to mention just a couple of general features of the trial that I think are noteworthy. First, no superior orders defense was allowed. You couldn't just say that you were merely following orders and shouldn't be held accountable on that basis. That was not allowable as a defense, at least during the findings portion of the trial. When it came to the punishment part of the trial, where a sentence was determined, you could raise the superior orders defense in order to mitigate your punishment. Furthermore, the procedure that was followed at the Nuremberg trials was a blend of Anglo-American and European law. And so, for example, the defendants could testify in court, and when they did, if they took an oath, they would be then subject to cross-examination by Allied prosecutors. This is an Anglo-American feature of law that's unknown in European jurisprudence. On the other hand, the defendants, so long as they did not take the oath, they could still speak in court. They could make statements as long as they were unsworn, and that would immunize them then from cross-examination. This was a feature that was familiar to European courtrooms that was pretty foreign to Anglo-American law at the time. The trial began on November 20th, 1945 in Nuremberg. The verdict was announced 11 months later on October 1st, 1946. All of the defendants, save 3, were convicted. This was not the only trial that would be held at Nuremberg. It was, however, the only international military tribunal held there to preside over the crimes of the Nazis. The original plan was to hold several trials of Nazi war criminals at the IMT, but for various reasons I don't have time to get into, the decision was made not to do this. And instead, the Allies decided to entrust prosecution to each of the occupying powers in its occupation zone. So the Soviets would have their trials in their zone, the British would have theirs, the French would have theirs, and then the United States would have its trials as well. These are the American trials consisted of 12 trials altogether, sometimes called the subsequent trials at Nuremberg, that prosecuted the next level down then of Nazi perpetrators. These were serious war criminals and serious war crimes, but they were not the top people. Right? These trials included a handful of perpetrators involved in SS-related crimes. And of the SS trials, case number 9, which began on September 29th, 1947, prosecuted the Einsatzgruppen. These are the mobile squads that shot hundreds of thousands of Jews in Eastern Europe during the war. The head, well, like this guy, by the way, Otto Ohlendorf, who was the head of one of the Einsatzgruppen units, and Heinz Jost, another commanding officer, both of whom were charged along with other Einsatzgruppen commanders during this trial. The head of the trial program, the Americans at Nuremberg, prosecuted the Einsatzgruppen, was a very young fellow at the time. He was 27 years old when the trial was unfolding. And this is Ben Ferenc. There he is a very young, fresh-faced fellow, 27 years old, and the head of the American prosecution team for the Einsatzgruppen trial. He is the last living prosecutor from Nuremberg, and we will hear from Ben Ferenc next. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay. I am going to now, my name is Michael Bazyler. I'll be speaking after Ben, but what we ended up doing is the three of us contacted Ben and we interviewed him and ended up getting a very nice video of him. As far as I know, it's the only video that's available on YouTube of Ben Ferenc at age 100 telling us the story. We don't have the time to play the entire video, but we wanted to bring Ben Ferenc into this conversation and the meeting today. And so we're going to play just the beginning portion. It's unedited. You'll see kind of when we introduce Ben, and then I'll go and to the portion where he speaks about his involvement and what he did as the chief prosecutor at age 27. We just cannot, speak enough about what Ben did, what he does. He's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize many times. There's a documentary on Netflix called Prosecuting Evil, The Extraordinary World of Ben Ferenc. Very much urge you to watch it. And also on YouTube, a 60 minutes interview of Ben Ferenc by Leslie Stahl. And unlike our current president, he didn't walk out of the interview. He actually stayed for the entire time. And it was a couple of years ago, and it's now available on YouTube, and you can watch that. So there's just not enough, time that we can speak and enough kudos that we can give to Ben. But let me go ahead and begin and bring Ben to you here. I'm going to now share screen. I have computer sound. Ben should be now appearing on your screen. And this is the beginning with the three of us in the background and Ben on the screen.
So I'm deaf, actually. Like I'm 100 years old. The left ear is 100 years old.
All right. So Ben, this is going to be a presentation that we'll be showing at the University of Texas in Dallas.
Right.
And it's going to be commemorate the 75th anniversary of the Nuremberg trials. So, all of us are very lucky that we're going to have during this commemoration, we get to have the last living prosecutor from Nuremberg, Benjamin Ferenc.
I'm alive still. Oh my God.
That's you. To come to speak to us.
All right.
And before we begin, I have with me my colleagues, Professor Kristen Nelson and Professor Michael Bryant. And you're the star of the show. We are just the backup players.
Are you Wilson? Wilson? Who's Wilson? Who's this nice young lady here? Going over the corner.
Oh, Ben, I'm Kristen Nelson, and I have had the pleasure of working with you alongside Michael Bazyler on a book chapter about some of the lesser known aspects of your life relating to your work on property restitution.
Huh. Well, that's good. That's good. Did you have anything there? I'm just looking at the official record of the trial of war criminals, to checking some dates here. And what's today's date? Today is you don't know September from October. So today is September 12th, is it? On September
10th.
this is unbelievable. 10th on September 15th, 1947. Filed on September 22nd, 1940. I made the opening statement for the prosecution in the biggest murder trial in human history. 29 September 1947. That's pretty close time. How many years ago? 75 years ago. Yeah. So that's the anniversary. I was 27 years old. I'm now 101. That's a pretty big gap. So I think that's an interesting point. I've forgotten, of course, the dates, but I've got the judgment here was in April, and the sentencing was in April. Anyway, so there we are. I've been at it for a long time, and should I sum it up in 2 words, or 2 hours, or 2 years, or 2 days? How much time do you think I need to know what to put into it? Just to say we were trying to prevent it from happening. Well, we haven't been doing so hot. It's getting not so good today, but I always end on an optimistic note. So give me your guidance, whoever's supposed to be telling me what to say and do, okay? And I'll do my best, that's all.
Thank you, Ben. I'm going to begin with an important question, which is, did you do your push-ups this morning?
I use my push-ups as a measure of how I feel. It's not a matter of sentiment. I judge by the facts. And so this morning, after my usual 20 minutes of calisthenics, I did, in order to remind of my age, 101 push-ups. I do that every morning. Try it. And then I say, how I said, no, I know I'm okay. Otherwise, I wouldn't know it. Okay.
So you can see here, I mean, the sense of aliveness, there's the humor, just an amazing, amazing man. The whole interview is, and he spent with us over 1 hour. And originally, Mike and Kristen and I prepared a whole bunch of questions to lead him through. We didn't have to, because he just kept going from one topic to another, to another, to another, and spent over an hour with us. And you can watch the entire interview on the website of the Ackerman Center. Let me move forward now, and when the portion where he discusses the Einsatzgruppen trial. I'm going to try to cue in just around that time.
Trials that were prosecuted against Nazi war criminals.
They were very different, because the first assignment from Telfer-Taylor was, look, you know how to collect the evidence. The evidence is mostly in Berlin. Get whatever steps you need, go to Berlin, come up with the evidence for the 12 trials which were anticipated. And I did. I put together a crew of about 50 people, all former German speakers, many of them refugees. And I said, oh, look, you handle the industrialists, you handle the SS, you go here, you go there, cover the different places. And one day, one of my guys comes in and he says, look what I have. Look what I have. He has a big pile of papers here. And it's a big thing, like a loose leaf binder. Ereignismeldungen aus der UdSSR. I'm showing off my German. It means events out of the Eastern Front. And in it were the daily reports by the officers, campaign officers of a group called Einsatzgruppen, which literally meant action groups, but was deliberately not given a more descriptive title, A, B, C, and D. And The German terrain, as the Germans occupied it, was divided, Poland, Russia, and so on, into different segments. And A was to handle it, Russia, the other was to handle the Romanians, and so on. And they wrote their daily reports. And they had printed 99 copies of that. And I had the distribution list for the 99 people who received them, who later said I didn't know anything about it. It was a daily chronicle of how many units, how many Jews were killed by that particular unit, where and when, and who was in charge. Dream thing. I took a little adding machine and started to add them up. When I reached 1 million people murdered that way, I said, that's enough. I took a sample. I took the next plane down from Berlin to Nuremberg. I said, General Taylor, he'd been promoted to general, we have to put on a new trial. He says, we can't. The Pentagon has already approved our budget. All the lawyers have been assigned. They're not going to agree to a new trial. I said, you can't let these guys go. I've got this murder in my hand, mass murder, and you just can't let them go. And he said, well, can you do it in addition to your other cases, your other work? And I said, sure. So he said, okay, you do it, okay? And so it came to pass that I was assigned what turned out to be the biggest murder trial in human history. I've disappeared from the screen here. I guess they were frightened. My screen has disappeared. Are you hearing me okay?
Oh, yes, we're fine.
Okay.
We can hear you and see you.
Okay, that's even better. I don't have to look at myself. He is going to be the chief prosecutor. I picked up a few other lawyers who some of the other cases I wanted to get rid of. And I drew up the indictments. And one of the problems that I think is worth mentioning is in the opening statement, I thought to myself, look, I was limited to 22 defendants for the ridiculous reason that was the number tried in the International Military Tribunal trial against Goering. And that's the only seats we had in the courtroom. So I was limited. It's ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. And I thought, well, you can't have justice. You can't talk about justice. They kill 1 million people and you try 22. That's not going to be just no matter what you do. So that if we are going to have some significance to this trial, let it be more than just a search for justice which you can't reach. We should establish the principle of law that all people are entitled to live in peace and dignity, regardless of their race or creed. Because the people, most of them were murdered because they were Jews, also because they were communist officials. And I thought if I can get a principle of law which would protect everybody, then it would be much more meaningful than whatever we did with these 22 mass murderers. And so I never asked for the death penalty. I asked for a principle of law that would protect everybody by upholding human rights through the rule of law. And that's what I asked for. I said in my opening, may it please your honors, it is with sorrow and with hope that we here present a case, the murder of over 1 million innocent people, innocent and defenseless human beings. Vengeance is not our goal, nor do we seek merely a just retribution. The case we present is a plea of humanity to law. That was my thing. And the 3 judges, in due course, I rested my case in 2 days. 2 days! I didn't call a single witness because I don't need a single witness. I got the names of the guys who committed, who wrote the reports. It's top secret. I'm not going to confuse this trial with anything else. I'm just going to ask these bastards, is this your name? Did you sign this? Is this how many people you killed? Take it from there. And so I was able to rest the case in 2 days. I convicted all of them. And 12 of them were sentenced to death. I didn't ask for the death penalty, and I was rather surprised because the chief judge was Michael Masmano of the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, and he was rather a joyful fellow, and he had his naval uniform underneath his robe, and he'd be kibitzing a lot of the time with things, and I didn't think that was the right place for it. And but when we came to the judgment, it came to the sentencing a couple of days later, it was very dramatic. The courtroom, if some of you may know the pictures of it, is right over the prison. The prison is right underneath, and it comes into the courtroom through a little van, a lift, and it's a small, about this big, and from the basement up into the room court. There, the doors opened, sliding doors opened, and the prisoner steps out, puts the earphones on, and listens and says, "For the crimes of which you have been convicted, which were spelled out the day before, this tribunal sentences you to death by hanging." They bow, take off the earphones, step back, boom, the doors were closed. Next one comes out. "Oh, for the crimes of which you committed, this tribunal sentences you to death by hanging." Boom, boom. Death by hanging, death by hanging, death by hanging. I thought my head was going to bust. Dead silence in the courtroom. No applause, no moan, no nothing. Everything's quiet. Death by hanging, death by hanging, death by hanging. It was a custom by that time for the chief prosecutor of any of the 12 trials to invite his staff to a party to celebrate the end of their particular trial. And I had also arranged that people would meet in my home for a celebration. I didn't have the feeling to want to go to my own party. I had a splitting headache. I went home and went to bed. And so that's why was I that way? I don't know. But it was a very grim experience. Now, my face has disappeared from this screen. Can I get it back somehow? Anybody here? Carlotta, anybody here?
Hello, Ben?
The screen is this way.
Oh, you were disconnected. Hello?
No, you're here.
Oh, we're
are here.
still here.
Okay, they're here, Ben. Don't worry.
I don't worry. I don't look at myself.
But they can listen to you.
All right, you hear me all right? But it's
We can,
oh, there we are.
Okay, don't touch anything. Don't move.
I didn't. I know, but I don't think moving is my
Okay, it
job.
happens sometimes, Ben. Okay.
All right, so there we get to the end of the trial. Now, the trial, as well indicated, that was a very dramatic experience. I had never wanted to talk, and I never talked to any of the defendants eye to eye. I had investigators and researchers, and I told them to interview each of the defendants. I want to know everything from the day he was born till the day he died. So I knew the background of all the defendants, and it was on that basis and the documentation that I was able to present the case and rest the prosecution's case in short order. The only time I talked to any of the defendants was after they had read the sentencing, and I wanted to talk to one of them in particular. He was Dr. Otto Ohlendorf, a general in the SS. He, according to his report, had killed 90,000 Jews. And he was asked on the trial, do you admit that your unit under your direct command killed 90,000 Jews? He said, I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? This is your report. You signed it. It's top secret. He said, yes, but you know, the men like to brag about the body count. And so they exaggerated sometimes. Said, well, would you say 70,000, 80,000? Yeah, that would be right. it was interesting to me that they would brag about the body count. They were so proud of how many they killed. Later, I'll tell you, oh, I was against it. You know, I was bearing superior orders. Bullshit. They were bragging about the body count, and that was a giveaway for them. So, but he was being honest. He said that, and I knew he was the father of 5 children. He had also testified in the International Military Tribunal trial about the killings going on by the SS. And he was well educated. I'm sure he was kind to his cats and dogs. And I thought, what the hell? I'll go down and talk to him. And I was sure he was going to hang. And I went down to the underneath the courtroom, and he's in a cell. I open a little door, open the window, and I said to him in German, "Can I do something for you, Mr. Olonov?" And he said, "You'll see I was right. The Russians are going to come in. The Jews in America will suffer for this too. And what you were doing to me, it's not just." I slammed the door shut on him. That was enough. He was repeating the argument he had made during the trial with proof of documents submitted, books by German experts by the ton, saying that self-defense is permissible. Anticipatory self-defense, which is what he was arguing, is permissible. And the judges, led by Masmano, said that is no defense. It's stupid, it's dangerous, and it's not the law. And they ignored it. It became of great interest to me not very long ago when our president of the United States, Mr. Donald Trump.
Okay, I'm going to stop here. So you can watch the whole interview, by just going to the link. I also want to mention to you that Ben stayed, and as Kristen had asked them at the beginning, he stayed in Nuremberg afterwards. He stayed in Germany afterwards. All his 4 children were born in Germany, and he stayed on because after prosecuting the perpetrators, he went on to help the victims by beginning the plan for reparations by Germany, for the restitution of the Jewish property in Germany. And he didn't stop just with the Jewish victims. He also represented Polish Catholic women who were used for gruesome medical experiments in the German camps. And in fact, this is during the communist times when he ended up getting compensation for these women in the 1960s, was invited to communist Poland in order to be thanked, because the victims of Nazi atrocities living behind the Iron Curtain did not get any compensation. The payments that West Germany made beginning in 1952 were just to the West, and it was not until the fall of the Berlin Wall. So you can see that there's the extraordinary life of Ben Ferenc. Ben also, when the International Criminal Court held its very first trial based upon this law that was done in Nuremberg, was appointed a special prosecutor for 1 day. And he gave a part of the closing statement in the International Criminal Court in The Hague. So he's just, we cannot say enough, about Ben. Let me go on now to the portion of my presentation. I want to say first, thank you, Niels. Thank you, Cindy, for inviting us. We had the great pleasure, Mike and Kristen and I, to speak at the SC conference in Dallas in person in March. And that was right when the coronavirus was starting. I remember thinking at that point, I wasn't even thinking about wearing a mask, but should I shake people's hands? That was the issue at that time as we were standing at the buffet line. So you can see we're living in a quite different world just, 6 months later. What I'd like to do in my presentation is to speak about the testimony and the evidence that was presented on the Holocaust, the murder of the Jews themselves. When Ben speaks about the tallies of the murders, the victims, these were primarily, almost 98% Jews, because what the Einsatzgruppen did is they went into a certain, large city, small shtetl, would round up the Jews and would take them out to the countryside in order to murder them. And I have a personal connection to this because my mom was in one of those shtetls in the Ukraine, in Slavuta. And when the Germans came in 1941, she was 15 years old. And luckily was able to flee and ended up fleeing east all the way to the Soviet hinterland to Uzbekistan, where I was born. And so it's ironic that meeting Ben so many years later, he had prosecuted the generals who were there in order to murder, my family members, my mom and my grandparents. It's important to note, though, that at the IMT trial, the Holocaust was not the major theme. The major theme at the IMT trial that Professor Bryant talked about was to put the major war criminals on trial for war of aggression, for waging aggressive war. But yet, throughout the trial, there was a lot of testimony that was given on the murder of the Jews. During the trial itself, the four Allied powers divided the case, the prosecution case, according to the crimes that Professor Bryant mentioned. And the French and the Russians, the Soviets, were given the job of prosecuting the crimes against humanity. And this is where the persecution of the Jews and the murder of the Jews was part of that. It is interesting that, and I'll talk about this in a moment, the evidence that they put on, because unlike Ben, they did put on live witnesses, but just very few. There were only 3 Jews that testified in the IMT trial and talked about firsthand as to what happened. But let me fast forward and go to the defense case, because each of the defendants, including Göring, were given an attorney, German attorneys, and they had a chance, after pleading nicht schuldig, not guilty in the indictment, to take the stand if they wanted. And Göring took the stand. And he was cross-examined by Justice Jackson, and then he was cross-examined by the other prosecutors. And it's interesting that the most damning testimony came not by the cross-examination by Justice Jackson, but by the British prosecutor, Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, who was a barrister and really knew how to, cross-examine defendants. And what Maxwell Fyfe did is to focus on the acts themselves. Jackson focused on the policy, and he wanted to say, let me get to the questions themselves. And let me just read you from the testimony of Göring on the stand and Maxwell Fyfe trying to pin him down as you would any prosecutor in any criminal case. And I'm going to read this to you now, and you'll see that Göring lies. He bold-faced lies. So Fyfe asked him, will you please answer my question? Do you still say neither Hitler nor you knew of the policy to exterminate the Jews? Göring answers, as far as Hitler is concerned, I have said I do not know. As far as I am concerned, I have said I do not know. Even approximately to one extent, these things were taking place. Fyfe, you did not know to what degree, but you knew there was a policy that aimed at extermination of the Jews. Göring, no, a policy of immigration not liquidation of the Jews. I knew only that there had been isolated cases of such perpetrations. That is a bold-faced lie. And you had individuals who later on ended up talking about what the German high command knew, and everyone was aware of what the policy was. Let me now focus on one witness that was there, and it's a witness that was put on the stand by the Soviets. Name you might have heard, but he is the recognized today as the greatest Yiddish poet, and his name is Abraham Sutzkever. Sutzkever went on to live in Israel after the war. He was trapped in the Vilna ghetto in Lithuania, where his first family was killed. After the war, he went to Israel, started another family, and he was put on a stand to talk about what happened during that time. His testimony is available on portions of it on YouTube. You can also get the full testimony. But he ended up testifying, and he wanted to testify at that time. He was still living in the Soviet Union in his native language, the language that he was most familiar with, not Russian, but Yiddish. And he was told that they didn't have a Yiddish interpreter. And so he'd have to testify in Russian, which is what he did. And he also, as an honor in memory of the Jews that died, he did not want to sit down. And he ended up standing during this testimony. So let me show you a portion of that testimony of Abraham Sutzkever testifying in Russian.
You may want to unshare the previous video before you restart this one.
Wish to give his testimony in
Oh, sorry guys, I'm going to stop ban. Are you folks seeing my screen?
No, we're not.
We're not. Okay.
No.
Okay, hold on. Let's see here. I know. This. And how about now?
We have it now.
Okay, let me put on the full screen. And I'll go back to the beginning.
Abraham Sutzkever, a Jewish poet born in Lithuania, wished to give his testimony in Yiddish, but was obliged to speak Russian. Afterwards, he wrote freely of his experience in Nuremberg.
For the 2 nights before my court appearance, I did not sleep a wink. I could see my mother, naked, fleeing across the snow-covered field. The hot blood that ran from her bullet-riddled body began to run down the walls of my room and encircle me.
You must sit down if you wish.
Twice I said that I did not wish to sit as others did. I spoke standing up, as if to recite the Kaddish for those who had died.
Please tell me, witness, where were you at the time of the German occupation?
In the city of Vilnius.
You lived in this city for a long time during the German occupation?
I lived there from the first to nearly the last day of the occupation.
You witnessed the persecution of the Jews in that city? I would like you to tell the court about this.
Когда немцы захватили моего города Вильну,
when the Germans captured my city, Vilnius, about 80,000 Jews lived there.
ловцы, этот же зондеркоманда, или как евреи,
The manhunters of the Sonderkommando, or grabbers as the Jews called them,
ворвались днем и ночью,
would break into Jewish houses at any time, day or night,
вырвали отсюда
drag away the men,
мужчину, сказали взять с
instructing
собой
them to take a piece of soap and a towel,
и полотенце, и загнали их в направлении
and herd them into certain buildings near the town of Panare, about 8 kilometers from Vilnius.
откуда почти никто.
From there, hardly one returned.
Когда мы дошли до старой синагоги, этой улицы,
When we reached the old synagogue, I saw a pile of wood stacked in the shape of a pyramid.
что там лежит дров в форме пирамиды. Немец выбрал револьвер.
A German drew his revolver and told us to take off our clothes.
Когда мы уже были голые, он взял спичку и
Once we were
подпалил
naked,
дров.
he lit a match and set fire to the stack of wood.
Тогда второй немец вынес
Then another German brought out of the synagogue 3 Torah scrolls,
дал нам их
gave them to us,
и сказал,
and ordered us to dance around this bonfire,
этого костра и пели
singing Russian songs.
И за нами стояли эти три немцы,
Behind us stood the 3 Germans.
гнали их огня.
They forced us at bayonet point toward the fire,
Мы уже били почти
laughing the
без
whole
сознания.
time.
Немцы ушли. Но я должен сказать, что массовое
When we
истребление
were almost at the point of collapse, they left. I must say that the mass extermination of the Jewish people in Vilnius began at the moment when District Commissioner Hans Hinks arrived, as well as the expert on Jewish matters, Murr.
Мура.
Okay. I will, oops. Here. Sharing the screen. Can you see this? On the screen? There's
We see you right now.
Pardon me?
We see just you right now.
Okay. Do you see the Sutskever's poem, A Wagon of Shoes?
No.
Ah, okay. Let me.
There you go.
Okay. So this is his most famous poem. This is not the entire poem. A Wagon of Shoes. He wrote this on January 1st, 1942, while trapped in the Vilna ghetto. We're commemorating here the 75th anniversary of the trial. and commemorating also the victims. Let me read part of the poem. The wheels they drag and drag on. What did they bring and whose? They bring along a wagon filled with throbbing shoes. The shoes, familiar, spreading. I recognize them all. The heels tap with no malice. Where do they pull us in? From the ancient Vilna alleys, they drive us to Berlin. Tell me the truth, O shoes. Where disappeared the feet? The feet of Pam Sorshati with button drops like dew. Where's the little body? Where's the woman too? Or little shoes, but where are all the children's feet? The heels tap with no malice. Where do they pull us in? From the ancient Vilna alleys, they drive us to Berlin. Me now.
Abram Sutzkever, a Jewish poet born in...
Stop here. Let me stop here. What I'm going to do is give the floor to Professor Nelson. I have a video, which I'm going to try to find, of Sutzkever actually reading the poem in Yiddish. So he was not allowed to do so at Nuremberg. I'm going to try to do it here so you can hear it. But Kristen, please take the floor.
Thanks very much, Michael. And I apologize for the mood lighting. I learned that the power goes off at 3 p.m. at my office on Sundays. So it's a little bit dark here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and put up just a few photos. Are you able to see my PowerPoint?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. All right. Fantastic. Let's start not at the end. We'll start at the beginning. So thank you very much for this opportunity to be back at UTD, even though it's virtually on the Sunday afternoon with my two colleagues, and you know, a more virtual appearance by Ben. It really is a true privilege. I'm going to speak today about the legacy of Nuremberg and how it has shaped our modern understanding of justice. I'm going to look at it from a couple of perspectives, from both advancements in international courts and then also advancements, there we go, power's back on, and the law itself. Among the four of us here today, including Ben, my perspective is, of course, the newest. I was born in the 80s and 90s when there really was this explosion in the development of international law, and specifically how international law regulated the conduct of criminals. And prior to 1945, this notion of post-atrocity justice in a courtroom was really virtually unheard of. And against all odds, as Professor Bryant discussed, the democratic notion of no condemnation without due process eventually won out. And whatever the criticisms there are of Nuremberg, it was at its crux a reflection of how effective international justice can be when there is political will and necessary resources. But after Nuremberg, there really was little occasion for almost 40 years to reuse and build on the foundation of international criminal justice. That is until the 90s and early 2000s. And if you were with us in March, I shared this anecdote, and I'll do so again. I remember sitting in a lecture hall one evening when I was in an undergraduate, and I heard a lecture by a professor from the law school at my university, and she spoke of this international court in The Hague called the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And it seemed logical to me, as sort of a naive undergraduate, that of course there would be a place for individuals who had violated international laws in connection with perpetrating atrocities. I lived in a democratic society. That's how we did it at home. And it really didn't occur to me until a few years later that this road to the ICTY went right through Nuremberg. And if the period between Nuremberg and in the early 1990s, those 40 years, is memorable because no major changes in international criminal law occurred, then the 1990s were memorable because so much changed in international criminal justice, and Nuremberg was the catalyst. In the midst of the conflicts in the Balkans in 1993, the UN Security Council created the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the ICTY, based upon its Chapter 7 powers under the UN Charter. And this type of court with a specific mandate for one particular time period was called an ad hoc tribunal. It had jurisdiction or the right to investigate and punish individuals for grave breaches of the 1949 Geneva Conventions, violations of the laws and customs of war, genocide, and crimes against humanity. And when its doors officially closed in 2017, it had really done quite a lot. It indicted 161, sentenced 90, acquitted 19, referred 13 to domestic jurisdictions, and 2 cases were on appeal. And as of this year, there is only 1 case remaining on appeal, that of the commander of the Army of the Republika Srpska, Ratko Mladic. And then just 1 year later, under the same authority as the ICTY, the UN Security Council established the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, seated in Arusha, Tanzania, and it had jurisdiction over the prosecution of individuals responsible for genocide and other serious violations of international humanitarian law committed in Rwanda and in neighboring territories between the beginning and end of 1994. And it had jurisdiction over crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, and violations of common Article 3 to the Geneva Conventions, and I think its additional protocol 2. And it delivered its final judgment in 2012. So these 2 ad hoc tribunals, what is their connection to Nuremberg? Well, tellingly, Louise Arbour, the former chief prosecutor of both the Yugoslav and Rwandan tribunals, has said, quote, "Collectively, we're linked to Nuremberg. We mention its name every single day," close quote. These ad hoc tribunals were based on the Nuremberg model for international criminal justice, but they were improved upon. There was, for both of them, there was no real allegation of ex post facto laws. The crimes over which the tribunals had jurisdiction were well developed in international law at the time the statutes for the tribunals were prepared. They were also constituted by the United Nations, so there was less of an argument that they were victors' justice tribunals. There was no death penalty. There were no in absentia tribunals. There's also opportunity for appellate review, more due process guarantees, more diversity in the judicial bar, as well as other judicial actors. So these ad hoc tribunals were just, as I mentioned, just one-off courts to address a particular situation, much like Nuremberg. But the notion of establishing a general international criminal court had been percolating for a while, and it really found its time and place in history in the late 1990s. The 1998 Rome Statute, which entered into force in 2002, established the International Criminal Court, which is seated in The Hague. It is the first permanent treaty-based international criminal tribunal, which is competent to investigate and prosecute crimes of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression. And it operates under the principle of complementarity, which means that that court isn't going to take jurisdiction over a particular situation unless the country in question is unable or unwilling to take up the case itself. And there are 123 parties to the ICC, which does not include the United States, China, or Russia. There have also been a number of other tribunals, sort of one-off tribunals like the ICTR and ICTY that have been established since both of those tribunals, and they're what we call kind of a hybrid tribunal, where you have a combination of international law and domestic law, and you also have a complement of both domestic judges as well as international judges which hear these cases, and that has included the Special Court for Sierra Leone, the Special Panels for Serious Crimes in the District Court of Dili in East Timor, the Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia, and the War Crimes Chamber in the Appellate Division of the Court of, in the Appellate Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina, just to name a few of them. So as you can see, with respect to court systems, so like the Nuremberg model is really visible in our sort of recent reliance on a panoply of tribunals to sort of help us work on a component of post-atrocity justice. looking at the second way that the Nuremberg legacy is felt today, I'd like to speak about the development of the law itself. And I want to look at both from an international perspective and then something that kind of is near and dear to all of us, how Nuremberg may have an impact on some Supreme Court decisions this fall. So what are some of the ways that we see the legacies of Nuremberg in the laws that we rely on today? Well, since the judgment at Nuremberg, we've got the 1949 Geneva Conventions relating to war and armed conflict. We've got the 1948 Genocide Convention, and we've also got the precedents that was set by the ICTY and the ICTR in their case law, which has really helped us to better understand the contours of genocide and also component parts of crimes against humanity. So in 30 years, a lot has been achieved, largely thanks to that foundation of Nuremberg. There are, however, always there's always room for improvement. And one room for improvement is Professor Bryant mentioned that one of the major crimes that was prosecuted at Nuremberg was crimes against humanity. Well, it doesn't to date have its own convention. The International Law Commission, whose job it is to sort of look at what law ought to be and not necessarily what it is right now, has put together a draft convention on crimes against humanity, but it has not yet been circulated for signature. It is not by any means an operative convention. And we've seen since the IMT, there have been different definitions throughout the tribunal history of what a crime against humanity is. At the IMT, the crimes were murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other humane acts committed against any civilian population before or during the war. And then at the ICTY, the statute said that there had to be a connection to armed conflict. And then at the ICTR, there was no connection, a required nexus to armed conflict. And then at the ICC, again, there is no armed conflict nexus, but they add a whole panoply of new possible crimes that are a component part of crimes against humanity, including the crime of apartheid and sexual slavery. So it's all to say that we have a crime that started that appeared at Nuremberg and we still use today, but we don't have a uniform definition of what it is. And then, as I mentioned before, I'd like to conclude by seeing if we can tie Nuremberg back to our US courts. And it just happens that there's a case being heard in December, which, even though it seems like an unlikely nexus, the issue of Nuremberg will likely come up. And if you'll indulge me a couple of minutes, I'll help you make that connection. So in December, there is going to be a case heard under the Alien Tort Statute. And this is a centuries-old US law that gives federal courts jurisdiction over torts committed in violation of the law of nations. And since the 1990s, plaintiffs' attorneys in the United States have used this particular law to bring high stakes litigation against alleged perpetrators of mass human rights violations in US courts. And sometimes they prevail, most of the time they don't. And over the last 20, 30 years, the court has steadily chipped away at what plaintiffs would like to be an expanded definition of the law to provide greater justice for human rights violations in US courts. Well, there was a case in 2018 that said, the case is called Jesner versus Arab Bank, remember that, that said foreign corporations are not proper defendants for this particular type of case. And in December, the Supreme Court is again going to be looking at the statute, and it's going to be determining if a domestic corporation is an appropriate defendant for a case brought under the Alien Tort Statute. And I'm going to do two things. I'm going to give you the summary of the case in December, and you're going to think, no, this has nothing to do with Nuremberg. I'm going to give you part of the decision that Justice Kennedy wrote in 2018 in Arab Bank, and then you're going to see the connection to Nuremberg and why Nuremberg is still an important part of post-atrocity justice for plaintiffs today. So the facts of the case that's going to be heard, I believe it's December 1st. Professor Bazyler can correct me if I'm wrong on that. It is a case called Doe versus Nestle, and it involves child slavery on cocoa plantations in Cote d'Ivoire. The plaintiffs were Malian children who were trafficked across the border to Cote d'Ivoire, and they were forced to work under horrific conditions in cocoa plantations without pay, and they were subject to torture. And the defendants in the case didn't actually own or operate the plantations, but the allegations are that they exercised enormous control over the cocoa industry and actively and knowingly facilitated the use of child slaves in order to kind of suppress the global market price for cocoa. So the question again for the Supreme Court this December is, are these domestic corporations liable for torts committed in violation of the law of nations, for example, torture? Well, let's go back to what the Supreme Court said in 2018 about foreign corporations in the same kind of case, in the case Jesner versus Arab Bank. Now, Justice Kennedy, who's no longer on the court, wrote the opinion, the majority opinion, that held that foreign corporations were not subject to this alien tort statute law. And I'm going to read just a paragraph of what he wrote. And here goes. He wrote, quote, "It does not follow, however, that current principles of international law extend liability, criminal or civil, for human rights violations to corporations or other artificial entities. This is confirmed by the fact that charters of respective international criminal tribunals often exclude corporations from their jurisdictional reach. The charter for the Nuremberg Tribunal provided that the tribunal has jurisdiction over natural persons only. Later, a United States military tribunal prosecuted 24 executives of the German corporation IG Farben. Among other crimes, Farben's employees had operated a slave labor camp at Auschwitz and knowingly and intentionally manufactured and provided the poison gas used in the Nazi death chambers. Although the military tribunal used the term Farben as descriptive of the instrumentality of cohesion and the name of which the crimes were committed, the tribunal noted that corporations act through individuals. Farben itself was not held liable." So you see, in a case relating to child slavery in Africa that's going to be in front of the Supreme Court this year, this issue that was, that the court has noted about Nuremberg and corporations and corporate liability is going to be part of the case. And actually, my two esteemed panelists, Professors Bazyler and Bryant, just this week submitted a friend of the court brief in this case as Nuremberg scholars in an effort to clarify the record regarding the Supreme Court's reliance on Nuremberg jurisprudence to back up its conclusion that international law does not extend liability to corporations. And I defer to them on the specifics. Their knowledge of Nuremberg greatly exceeds mine. But I did want to mention this example just to show you that even after 75 years, the law of Nuremberg is extremely relevant, and it's going to be at front and center at the highest court in our country in December. And that's all I've got. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. I assume, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm back. Okay. So I did find Suits cover. Let me go ahead and share my screen. I first want to show you. So he and his wife were able to escape from the Vilna ghetto, and he became a partisan, actually fighting against the Germans. Do you see the photograph? Is it on the screen? Okay. And then here's some other photos of Sutzkever. He died in 2010 at age 94. Okay. I'm going to now finish with Sutzkever. One moment. Reading the poem in Yiddish. Listen to it. It's in Yiddish. You don't need to understand or speak the language. If you speak German, you might understand part of it. I read you part of the poem, but you'll see it's the way the poem is written. It's in the form of questions. And he's pondering, as in the Vilna ghetto, what the future is and what the future is of the Jewish people and of the victims that are there.
A Wogen sich,
Die Räder jogen, jogen, was bringen sie mit sich? Sie bringen mir a Wogen mit zappeln dicke Schich. Der Wogen wie a Chuppe in oventigen Glanz, die Schich a volle Kuppe wie Menschen in a Tanz. A Hasene, a Jontef, sie hat mich wer verblend, die Schich a Säune nonte, aufs Nei ich hab derkennt. Es klappen die Abzassen, wohin, wohin, wohin? Von alte Wilner Gassen, mit treibt uns Kim Berlin. Ihr darf nicht fragen, wem es, nur tut in Herz a Riss. O sagt mir schier dem Emes, wo sehnen sie die Fies? Die Fies von jene Tuffel, mit Knäpelech wie Toi, und da, wo ist das Guffel, und dort, wo ist die Freu, in Kinderschich in alle, wo seh ich nicht kein Kind, was tut nicht on die Kalle, die Schichelech hat sind. Durch Kinderschich und Schkrabes, ich derkenn mei Mame Schich, sie pflegt sie bloß auf Schabes, a räuft sie auf sich. Uns klappen die Abzassen, wohin, wohin, wohin? Von alte Wilner Gassen, mit treibt uns kein Berlin.
Niels, back to you.
Yes, thank you so much. I think at this point, I'm just trying to change my view here a little bit. We can all use our real hands or our electronic hands to applaud our various speakers. I'm using both, as you can see, but I think it also provides us now a little bit of an opportunity for you to ask questions. So you can ask questions either in the chat window or also by unmuting yourself, and you can obviously direct your questions at any one of our presenters. So the floor is open.
What about these questions?
He just said he's going to do it both ways.
So questions.
Dr. Romer, there are some questions already in the chat. I think that's what Ms. Simon was asking about.
Yeah, we can go back to the last one here, maybe just to start with. Let me just screen here a little bit further down. You know, this is a question actually still to Kristen Nelson, if we just go from the bottom up. And that is the question as to whether, would the separation of children from their parents and internment in inadequate quarters perpetrated by President Trump qualify for crimes against humanity? We're going easy right from the get-go.
A real easy one, sure. Thank you so much for your question. So twofold. I think if you're being really technical about a definition, if you're looking at the definition of crimes against humanity from, say, the International Criminal Court, you need a widespread or systematic, you need a crime committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against any civilian population. So it's a question of whether the deportation or forcible transfer of children from their parents would be considered widespread or systematic. And that would be an argument for the court. But then secondly, you have to look, okay, well then who would decide it's a crime against humanity? And as I mentioned, the United States is not actually a party to the ICC. So you can say, okay, well, even if I get to the point where I can say a crime against humanity has been committed, there's really not any form of redress because the US has opted out of jurisdiction to the ICC.
Thank you very much. Any more questions? You know, I'm just maybe in between, I appreciated you sharing the poem very much with us, because I think we sometimes maybe mistakenly think that the seeking of justice is identical to remembrance. And I think that's in lots of ways the kind of tension that we see at play always at the Nuremberg trial, where in many ways, as you now have numerous times indicated, the victims themselves have very little to say and had been given very little space. And so therefore this poem in lots of ways very eloquently brings out that perspective. So thank you very much for digging into your archive, Michael, and still finding it and making sure that we had a chance. And I think there's also something, like you said, to be said about hearing it in the Yiddish, where you actually get the rhyme scheme, regardless of whether you know the language or not, whereas the English is a little, it's powerful, but a little flattened out. You don't quite get the kind of rhythm of it as well. All right, that should have just bought everyone a little extra time to think on their feet now about some good questions. You know, maybe just to start us to emphasize again, Cindy had already indicated that the full video is really available on YouTube and the link is there. You know, what I thought, you know, watching the video was particularly impactful was the extent to which these issues, I mean, it came out in your presentation, Kristen, but also in lots of ways in this video, that these are far from being resolved, that they're kind of seeking to find some kind of lasting framework for justice and peace is, I mean, we're not that much closer now than we might have been back then. And I just couldn't help myself but thinking, you know, for someone like Ben, who has been, you know, was born right in the aftermath of the World War and saw these first attempts of the League of Nations, worked through his life, you know, it still has that spirit in it. That's really very remarkable, that in lots of ways in that video, he really concludes with that he's still in many ways trying to establish now this kind of framework, or think about a framework, which is, he calls it the planetarian perspective, right? The thinking about our world as a whole, which I thought was really remarkable, how one can take from what he has seen so up close, actually this very optimistic and you know, continuous commitment to these ideals.
And I see Dr. Price has both his literal and his virtual hand raised.
That counts as something, Ken, and you should have the privilege of asking a question if you show us both hands. Ken.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
So this is for Professor Bazyler. My parents, my whole family was from Lithuania. My father lived in a small town called Sarai, not far from Vilna and Mariupol. He and the woman who was to become my mother both left Lithuania. They fled in 1937. Most everyone who stayed behind were killed. Could you tell us a little bit more about your family story and your story?
Wow. Yes.
We can't hear you.
Yes. Yes. Can you see me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it always emotion grabs me, you know, when I say this, when I discuss this. I was born in Uzbekistan, in the country that doesn't exist any longer. And my grandparents didn't have the wherewithal to leave Europe like your parents or grandparents did in the 1930s. So my dad was born in Warsaw. The Germans came in 1939. He was the only one that survived, and he was age 17. He fled, and he had the good fortune, and I say this ironically, to be arrested by the NKVD, the predecessor to the KGB, because he refused to give up his Polish citizenship. And so he was shipped to Siberia. And so when the Germans came in 1940, well, when he survived in Siberia. If he stayed in the Soviet part of Poland when the Germans came in 1941, he surely would have been murdered. My mom was born in 1926. We're Galiciana Jews for a little town called Slavuta and in Ukraine. And the story that I grew up with, because my dad did not really talk about the Holocaust. He just had a lot of books, photo books for us to look at. But my mom would tell the story of fleeing that town and looking at the sky and just, you know, in fear as a young teenager of the bombs being dropped, you know, on her and her parents. And they fortunately, in a wagon, ended up fleeing far enough east. They were put on the train, and then they came and were evacuated to Uzbekistan. When my dad was released from the Siberian Gulag, he wanted to go from somewhere that's very cold to somewhere very warm. So he went all the way south to Uzbekistan, which is right about north of Afghanistan. And that's where my parents met and married. And since he was still a Polish citizen, I was age 5 in 1957. We emigrated to Poland, and I lived there. And in 1961, as refugees, we came to the United States. I will end as follows. We came, and by the refugee agency, we were placed in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which we didn't know where it was. To this day, I still root for the Minnesota Twins.
Thank you for sharing that with us. Maybe I'll ask a question. Yes.
Hey, Neil, can I?
Oh, Sally, yes.
Just a thought. Earlier, you mentioned why was Nuremberg selected as the place for the Nuremberg trials. But don't you think the fact that the Nuremberg laws originated there, which kind of kicked off the whole anti-Jewish hatred and prosecution of Jews, maybe that's the reason, because that's where the laws started? And the second question, maybe it's not too pertinent, but I think everybody remembers Judgment at Nuremberg, the movie. Yeah. And that made Americans aware, probably for the first time, of what Nazi crimes consisted of. But one thing I remembered about the movie was the German defense lawyer was very aggressive in defending his client. And I was wondering, as the trial went on, and you said that most of the times the victims didn't have a chance to talk, but in that movie, the victims spoke a lot. And then the German lawyer put up a very, very strong defense. So I'm wondering if you want to just comment on the impact of the movie Judgment at Nuremberg.
I think the first part of the question still goes to Michael Bryant, right? Why Nuremberg as the site of the IMT? If you want to speak to this again, Michael?
Sure, yeah. Is that Henry Hahn, is that right?
No, the question came from Sally Bolofsky, one of our board members.
Okay. Yeah, no, I mentioned this in passing in my presentation because I see references to this in the literature all the time. Why was Nuremberg chosen? And the Nuremberg laws is another thing that's sometimes cited along with the Nuremberg rallies, and the fact that Hitler very deliberately chose Nuremberg for the Nuremberg rallies because of his historic associations with German history. Going back to the Holy Roman Empire, it was one of the primary sites for the Holy Roman Emperor to meet in session with the various German princes. That goes back 1,000 years, right? So I think Hitler and his people were trying to channel this history and revive it with the Nazi movement. So there was some speculation that this is the reason why the Allies chose to center the trials in Nuremberg. But in the research that I've done, from all the references talk about just the importance of having a functioning courtroom. Don't forget how much of Germany had been bombed back to the Stone Age during the war. And there just were not that many cities that had fully functioning courtrooms with an attached prison. I mean, the fact that the prison was co-located there with the courthouse was extremely important to the Allies, because you could take the accused war criminals and house them right in cells. And you've seen the photographs of the various members. And in fact, Ben Ferencz talks about going and visiting with Otto Ohlendorf in 1947 before his execution. That's where he was being held, in one of these cells. And so they could be taken out of these cells and then brought up in the elevator directly into the courtroom 600. And it was just administratively really, really much easier than if they had to somehow improvise in a bombed out city, trying to come up with places where they could hold the sessions of court. So I look at it from a very pragmatic standpoint. I think the symbolism, maybe that played a factor too, but I think that the practicalities of it were the primary reason why Nuremberg was chosen.
Thank you.
And
Let me
then
add
now we can kind of talk about the second part of the question, the movie, The Judgment at Nuremberg. My recollection is it's largely thanks to Spencer Tracy that we believe that the movie actually does a lot about the victims themselves or the Holocaust, because the movie itself actually, if my memory is right, doesn't show much, but what we see is the judge, played by Spencer Tracy, watching it, and we see his face changing, and the change in his face is so powerful that I think that's what we remember often, Sally. But that's, it's been a while that I watched that movie. So anybody else who has a better or fresher memory is more than welcome to jump into this.
Well, the German attorney, the defense attorney, was played by the great Austrian actor Maximilian Schell.
That's right.
Yeah, and his sister Maria was also an actress.
Right.
And Maximilian came to the United States, and I think that this was his breakout role. But the trial, Judgment in Nuremberg, as the movie, screenwriter Stanley Kramer, that was in 1965. And I agree, it brought the Holocaust into the consciousness of the Americans. The event before that was 1961-62, which was the Eichmann trial, because this is where the Israeli prosecution focused specifically on having the victims come and testify and to tell their stories. And even though some of them could not tie Eichmann directly, they never saw Eichmann, they could tell the story. So the story of the Holocaust. And that was broadcast to the United States. And then afterwards, the movie Holocaust, the TV series, miniseries that came on. It was sort of like, the roots for African-American history and slavery. And that brought the consciousness. What's interesting about the Holocaust, and all three of us will agree, I think, to this, we each teach Holocaust courses, the graduate and law schools. How many students are still interested and have a passion for that? Usually a historical event, the farther you get away from the event, the less there's a memory. With the Holocaust, it's not. The consciousness, is with us. And so, all of us as professors are very glad. When we went to Dallas, Cindy and Niels, all the young people that were there at the conference that came and talked to us, it was wonderful to see that, because they are the next generation of scholars that will be continuing this legacy, not just to remember the Holocaust in Nuremberg as a historical event, but really for the never again. How do we prevent this, from happening again?
Thank you.
Very true. Any more comments or questions?
Dr. Romer, we do have one in the chat, and then Dr. Price has his hands up again.
Can you read the one from the chat? Sally?
So Henry Hahn asked,
Oh, yeah.
clerical duties aside, what role did women, lawyers, etc., play in the Nuremberg trials? There was a seminar this summer at the courthouse on this topic, which was canceled due to COVID.
Oh, I can answer that question. I love that question. Right? And yes, in fact, there's a book that I wrote called Holocaust, Genocide, and the Law. And in that book, I have one of the photographs is the only woman lawyer that was a podium prosecution attorney, meaning she was not just working on the staff, but she actually got to cross-examine the witnesses. And this was in trial number one, the medical trial. And then in that particular case, one of the defendants was a female German doctor. So you have both on the perpetrator and the defense side. There are a number of attorneys. There's a professor, Beth von Schack, who is specialized in looking at what she calls the women of Nuremberg and the role that they played. I want to point out the role of Gertrude Ferenz, who was there, who was not a lawyer, but who was the typist while Ben was there. And she actually typed up the opening argument that Ben put together. And she remembers, that. There's a wonderful documentary you may be able to get called Watchers of the Sky. And it talks about those individuals who are there to try to upstand against genocide. And Gertrude is in that movie with Ben together.
Thank you. All right, we're casting one more time a look at the chat window, but I think it's getting quieter. There was one correction that Maximilian Schall indeed is Austrian Swiss and not just simply German, but Austrian Swiss, just as a correction. All right, then I think I want to thank you again, all our wonderful speakers and also our wonderful attendees today to make this Einspruch lecture yet another big success and a memorable event. Thank you again all for being here, and stay close, and most importantly also stay safe, and hopefully there will be times again where we can have events where we can shake each other's hand. For now, I'm just going to wave at all of you and say goodbye. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye, everyone.
Good, wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks for everybody's participation.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Bye,
being with us.
everyone.
Our great
Thank you.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Niels.
Wonderful.
Raphael.
Thank you again. This has worked really, really well.
And thanks to Professor Romer for organizing this.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you for all being here, and thank you again for Cindy to have
Cindy, and to Cindy too. Thank you, Cindy, if you're still
coordinating
there.
all of this. Thank you, everyone, and stay close. I mean, we always plan more and do more, and please tell all of us, tell from all of us again, Ben, how much we appreciated the video and how much we really enjoyed watching him.
Absolutely. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Goodbye. See you, Ken.
Bye.
Let me see that
Oh, bye,
manuscript sometime.
Michael.
Let me see that
We'll-
manuscript sometime when it's done.
Yes, we'll chat later.
Okay, look forward to it. Stay in touch.
Great,
Cindy.
bye-bye.
See you. Bye, Cindy. Thank you again for everything.
Yes, sir.
Bye-bye.
Thank y'all. Bye, Dr. Price. Please tell Gloria hello.
I'm sorry, what?
I said bye, and please tell Gloria hello.
I said goodbye and I'm still here. You know the old joke at a party, a Gentile leaves without saying goodbye. A Jew says goodbye and never leaves.
That's a good one, Dr. Price.
I like that one.
Is it true? It's actually true.
You have a good evening.
I have a lot of Yiddish jokes for another time.
Bye. You take care, Ken. Seeing you.
You too.
Okay. Bye.
Stay,
Bye, Cindy.
stay
Goodbye,
safe in
everyone.
Albuquerque.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.